Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Anderson, and I'm Associate Superintendent for Spokane Schools, and we welcome you to this first of four community school boundary forums that is being offered to the community to provide our Boundary Adjustment Committee with important feedback, questions for us to consider. What you're going to hear tonight is a draft boundary proposal that the committee's been working on for about a year. And then we have more work to do after getting feedback from the community. We'll be doing that work in May and fine tuning our recommendation to the school board. Then we'll be presenting the school board with the recommendation toward the end of May, 1st of June. And then the school board will actually hold public hearings in early June through the middle of June, getting feedback from the community and for our committee as we kind of finalize the changes that will be occurring over the next 3 years. So I have a group of panelists with us this evening that I would like to introduce that are serving on the Boundary Committee. By the way, we have 53 both community members, parents, and school staff that have been working for over a year working on these proposed boundary adjustments to, and we'll share with you why we're doing that here in a little bit. But first, I'd like to just kind of go around the screen here and say who are some of the representatives tonight from our committee. First, we have Molly Merkel. Molly's a parent up on the north side. Molly, wave there. We have Sandra Gerard, who's our Director of Communication, has been assisting the committee. Ryan Rowe is our Supervisor of Fiscal and Student Data. He's been a real technical assistance there. Matt McFarland is Principal up at Salk Middle School. Craig Namata is our Budget Director, and Craig has been instrumental in providing us data and information about student data and information and so forth. Next, we have Julie Shepard. Julie's a parent up on the north side of the district, and along with Peter Richter, parent out on the west side of the district. Stephanie Lundberg, Stephanie wave there, is our new principal of the new middle school that will go right across on Foothills, across from GPRIM. Currently, we're calling it Northeast Middle School, but we are going through a naming process for that. Karina Fletcher is a teacher up on the north side of the district. Lindsay Shaw is a parent on the north side. Rod Tamura is both a resident of the north side and a parent, longtime resident of the north side of the district. Greg Forsyth is our Director of Capital Projects. And then finally, assisting us is Harriam Martin Morris, a longtime consultant with the school district, but also a former school board member with the Seattle Public Schools, and now a member of the State Board of Education. And then Phil Crocker. Phil has been working with us for about 4 years now, both on grade configuration changes, a variety of things, working with our curriculum department as well, and then assisting us with boundary changes as well. So with that introduction, let me pull up a slideshow that we're going to walk you through. This is going to take probably, so that you have a good, thorough understanding of the committee's thinking and work so far, it'll probably take about an hour. And then we're going to reserve a half hour for answering some of the questions that I'll be instructing you how to do during the chat. So with that, we'll start our presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is not the end of our work. This is a draft that is reflective of the committee's work for the past year. Tonight's webinar, first we're going to do the presentation, as I mentioned. During the presentation, if you have questions or comments, there's a Q&A feature that you will see there in the Zoom. Please just put your questions in there, and then we'll be able to record those, and at the end try to answer as many as we can. But also feel free to email the Boundary Adjustment Committee, and our email address is boundaries@sps81.org, and that'll come to the committee as well. At the end, as I mentioned, Phil is going to moderate for us and turn to different panelists to help answer some of the most common questions that we might see in the webinar tonight. And then I would encourage everyone to go to our school district's website. We have a very comprehensive, frequently asked questions with answers. We keep adding to it, actually, as we get more questions. So if you went to it a week ago, I would go back to it during this week because you'll see some more questions and some more answers. As I mentioned, the purpose of this forum is for our committee to present information about the draft work that our 53-member committee has done over the last year, to get your feedback for the committee's consideration as we continue our work in May. And here are the topics for tonight. So why are we doing this? Why adjust the boundaries? What's the timeline for that to happen? When will boundaries change? Who's been on the committee? What are some things the committee has found? Both a previous committee developed guidelines to change boundaries that the board adopted, but our committee has actually had some new influencers. So we're using both, and we'll talk about those. Talk about the estimated impact on how many boundaries are changing for students and families. We're going to talk about a legacy policy and legacy status or grandfathering. When the boundaries change, there will be an opportunity for students not to get disrupted in their current school and to stay in it. And I'll talk about that. The board adopted this policy recently. Then we'll talk about choice programs, choicing into different schools, option and special programs. And then finally, we'll get to the maps and talk about cohort information. So again, why are we changing boundaries? This started back in 2015, and it's really an trying to provide better educational opportunities for our students. And the legislature recognized that students and our early learners, if they're in smaller class sizes, the teachers have more time to get them off to a good start, especially in grades K through 3. So the legislature adopted and funded lowering class size and hiring more teachers across the state to have class size 20 or less in those younger grades. Well, to do that, we needed more schools because we didn't have enough room. Our schools were pretty packed as they were. So one reason is to get it so that we can get class sizes down at our younger grades. We're also growing in Spokane. Matter of fact, some of our local realtors have told us Spokane is the hottest housing market on the West Coast. So not only have we been growing, but we anticipate growing more. So being able to create capacity in our schools is another reason for these boundary changes. We are going to, and you may know, to help with this and being overcrowded at our elementary schools, we are going to be having new grade configurations where we're moving our elementary 6th graders up into middle school, and we're building 3 new middle schools as we speak, and we're remodeling or replacing our 3 oldest middle schools. And then finally, we're trying to, through this boundary work, balance school sizes to their capacity. What we mean by that is we have some schools that have been way too full. Matter of fact, they can't serve their neighborhood students. We've had to bus them to different schools. And then we've had other schools that have been way under capacity. So part of our boundary adjustments is to try to equalize out and give growth capacity in the neighborhoods for all of our schools. Kind of a secondary reason is we haven't done this for 40 plus years, and thus we are where we are, with some schools overcrowded and other schools underpopulated. So that's a kind of a secondary reason. And then another reason, as we've worked on this with the committee, is the opportunity to reduce the impact of transitions between school levels and having classes of students at schools actually go through and get to go to the same middle schools and then go to the same high schools. Currently, we have several schools where kids get split into different middle schools, and then they get split again into different high schools. So I think Harriam and Bill will talk about some of the research that says that keeping students together, lessening the impact of transition it actually improves students' academic achievement. So where are we? We started this long-range planning back in 2015, as I mentioned, when the legislation happened about lower class size. We immediately started that study about, do we have the right grade configurations? Matter of fact, to get class size down to 20 to 1 K3, it either meant building 6 more elementary schools in our study, or 3 new middle schools. And just because of available land in the district, the decision was to move to 3 new middle schools with 6th graders moving up. As you know, Spokane voters overwhelmingly passed the bond issue in 2013 that's allowing us to build those 3 new middle schools and replace our 3 oldest ones. So we immediately went to work and had a committee. Some of the committee members on the current committee actually served on this boundary guidelines committee. And we're going to talk about the guidelines they came up with and that the board adopted. And then now the board is going to be considering the draft boundary recommendations that our current committee is working on, that you're going to hear about tonight. And finally, then in June, the board will adopt those new changes a year ahead of time for the north side and 2 years ahead of time for the south side of the district. So here was our charge to the current committee to take the boundary adjustments to the school board for accommodating the expansion of these new middle schools throughout the district, using those guidelines that the board had approved. I won't go through everybody's name, but you can see it's a 53-member committee. We have representation of both parents and staff from different areas of the city, Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, Southwest. Karina is a teacher and representing the Education Association. We've had several principals, assistant principals working on this, several central office staff. We've actually had 2 school board reps on our committee over the course of this last year and a half. Our president, Jarrell Haynes, and Nikki Lockwood have been on the committee as well. So our process and timeline now is that we are exploring those options that we've been doing. We finally got a draft put together after a year that you're going to hear about tonight. We want your feedback here in April. Then we're going to go back to work, as I mentioned, in May and work on revisions and then present those to the board in June, and have the board plans to have public hearings again, where it's now they're hearing directly from the community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Harriam Martin Morris. Harriam helped us develop these boundary guidelines, and I would like him to talk about what they mean and the importance of them as we do our work.
Thank you, Mark. As you can see by the slide, there are several things that we talked about when it came to the guardrails as we did the work within the committee. One, we wanted to be clear that we are communicating with as many people as we know how, what the process is, how it worked, where we are, and this is part of that communication, these forums. And diversity, for us, we're not talking about it in terms of ethnicity. We're more focused, because of the nature of the district, around economic diversity. And that's kind of the rails that we put on ourselves as we did it. Legacy, you may have heard a lot about that. It used to be called grandfathering, but that was a bit paternalistic. So we're calling it legacy. That's where you get to stay at the school that you currently are under certain circumstances. Neighborhood, this is one that it comes up quite a bit. For the purposes of for the work that we're doing and for this presentation, the term neighborhood is really cohorts. Cohorts are are not just neighborhoods tend to be thought of as geographic. We're looking in terms of cohorts of students, which are clusters of students in certain geographic regions. And the research is very clear about this around cohorts. They're good for students, especially during transitions. And if anyone's ever interested, I have dozens of papers that talk about the importance of the cohort model as you move forward. This is why the proposal strives to keep students together K-12. And quite honestly, for a district the size of Spokane, this proposal does a lot of that, and it's amazing that was able to do that. School quality. This is another thing that was important. And again, this is not about test scores. There are lots of things that are influencing school quality, and Spokane is very good in the fact that they have what they call key performance indicators that help improve the overall school quality. And that's work that the superintendent is adamant about and working towards and striving that every school in Spokane is a quality school. Transportation, another one of those things that as we are doing the work, we had to keep that in the back of our mind with the hope that if we've done it close to right, there is no increase in the cost of transportation, and there may even be a slight decrease. We don't get into the situation of transporting kids past 2 schools to get to a 3rd school kind of thing. So those were the guardrails that we put up.
And those were adopted by the board before this committee started their work. So we've used these guidelines to actually further refine the work that we have been doing. And I would ask Phil to talk about some of the other influencers that our committee have as we've studied this, feel important for the kind of draft that we're going to present to you tonight.
Thank you, Mark. As the committee did their work on starting to work through the boundaries, we expected it, and it was true that those guidelines were fairly high level. They were, as Harriam described, guardrails to keep the conversations focused, because there's a myriad of things outside of those that folks could have focused on. But we needed a little more definition in some of those. So those became influencers in a sense that the committee refined and worked with. And some of these were helped. We went back to the board and the superintendent and asked for their clarification on a few, like how did they want to address that? So one of the keys was areas of growth. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but we really did need to bring in where are developments occurring, where are developments anticipated, where's the growth happening, and where won't growth happen, either because of density that's already there or industrial zoning or things. So the boundaries, as Mark had pointed out, have been over 40 years, and they're kind of a mishmash in some places to accommodate the growth that's happened. So as we looked at areas of growth, the committee wrestled with those. Maintaining cohorts to limit impacts on transitions. Harriam described that perfectly. That especially transitions, especially impact students who are already struggling in other areas, either socioeconomically impacted, academically struggling. What we do know is doing those transitions with cohorts, keeping families together through the K-12 experience has a hugely positive impact on those. So that became an important piece as we work through it. Balancing school sizes. We have schools in the district that students who live in the neighborhood of the school can't get into because they're already over capacity. And we have other schools that have more capacity, but their students haven't been assigned in that area for some time because it used to be there. So balancing out the school sizes achieves the goals of allowing all the kids who are assigned to a school to be able to actually attend that school if they so choose. And also it should allow for more options in the choice program. So one thing Spokane prides itself in is its portfolio model of families having choices around where their kids go. And this should allow a broader option of choices than exists when many schools, again, can't accept any choice kids because they're over capacity. We're moving 6th grade up, and we'll talk about that in more detail, but by moving 6th graders into the middle schools, it automatically creates a situation where we need to move some kids out of those same schools to make room. And then we have 50% more middle schools coming online. And that's what that movement facilitates. We did look at family access to school. This came important. We did look at public transportation, transportation corridors. Our families currently walking to a school, our kids currently walking to schools, especially at the elementary level. And the committee really took that into consideration district-wide. And I think that's important. And then again, maintaining the neighborhood cohorts. This is a bit of a water balloon in Spokane because as in every city, socioeconomic status tends to be clustered by neighborhoods and areas. And if you want a perfect balance of socioeconomic status across all your schools, that is going to create a different pattern than if you want cohorts of kids to stay together from their neighborhoods and go to schools together. And we'll talk about that. We have some pieces we can show on that. But the committee wrestled with all of these things. Many of them, this last one, they wrestled with a lot in different areas of the city. So those are the influencers. Craig, I think on our next slide, thank you, Mark. This gives a bit of an example. Craig and Ryan did a fantastic job of bringing a lot of data to the committee for views as we went through these different iterations. And you know, in total, the committee probably saw nearly 100 different scenarios. We have more than 100 that have been run. As they refined it, they would send us back to do work after the meetings, and ask us to refine certain areas and come back and bring them more data and more refinement. This is an example, what you're seeing here, of free and reduced lunch status from before, which is the base, and revised, which is the proposed, top to bottom. If you look, and we have little arrows there, and you can see vertically. So for example, on the left, Glover was 75% free and reduced lunch, and in the proposed, it would be 67% free and reduced lunch. So just under 10% shift that way. And these are this free and reduced lunch adjustment is representative of the clustering of students into cohorts that move together. So of course, you know, when you do that, the cohort's going to be representative of the part of the city, the socioeconomic status of the city it's from. So that's just practical. You can see there's other items up top. Balanced enrollment was a big one we had to sort out. Free and reduced lunch, which represents this. Special education, we did look at. We had some committee members who made sure that it stayed on the forefront. We made sure we weren't clustering special education students. English language development, similarly, we want to make sure that sometimes some models just didn't work out because they brought a large population into one school rather than maybe into different schools where they could be better served. And then racial diversity was looked at. Again, in Spokane, there's not a lot of difference in the models on racial diversity or on English language development, actually, on the different models of any that we looked at. But we did carry that data forward, and we will continue to do so as the committee continues to do its work. That data is always in front of them. Craig, anything you want to add on this?
No, I think that you got that one, this slide covered.
Okay.
And Phil and Craig, am I correct that the numbers and percentages here are in a way modeling? It's not actually how it turns out because we have a choice policy in the district that allows students to move around. So it's not exactly the way it is. It's a projected of that neighborhood. Am I correct?
Correct. Craig, do you want to just spend 2 seconds on sort of the data set we're using for student population?
Sure. So we our overall goal with elementary, middle, and high was to look at where students live and to draw boundaries based on resident populations and to try to balance those things across all three levels. Through our district's option programs and choice policy, that isn't the reality of where all students end up. So these are our best approximations of kind of our baseline starting, and with a recognition that some of the percentages may go up a little bit, they may go down a little bit, depending on what options families are able to access.
It did give us a static comparative set as we went through the iterative models so that the committee could feel comfortable comparing model A to model B. On this next slide, Craig, why don't you walk us through what we attempted to do and where this this is actually a boundary map that was brought forward to the committee at their request.
one of the questions that we have seen in responses in email to what our committee has done and what things we've thought about. And one of the first things that came up in our committee is this is an opportunity to try to balance socioeconomics across all schools in our system. And with 9 middle schools populated, 3 in the Northwest, 3 in the Northeast, and 3 in the South, is there an opportunity to draw lines such that we could get balanced free and reduced price lunch socioeconomic status? This is a version of kind of what it would look like in order to get every single school balanced to fit the population that the school could hold, and similar free and reduced price lunch rates across all schools. It's pretty problematic in that it creates a significant amount of transportation issues.
And it splits nearly every elementary school in the city. Kids would not be able to go to school with some of their peers. They would have, at every transition, they would split. So, but this was the most balanced model. The other question the committee struggled with was, okay, why can't we just send kids to the closest schools? That seems to make I mean, some districts have tried this, some large districts have tried this, and we have some experience there. So, for example, these are 2 middle school maps. And the circles represent about a 1.25 mile distance, which for most of the middle schools is what it takes to fill the middle school. So if we drew a 1.25 mile circle around each of the middle schools, you can see that on the left-hand map, all the students fit into those. Now, if you look at the new Northwest Middle School off to the left, it has very few students in it. And it's because it's on the edge. It's the edge of the school district boundary. And there's just not more kids to fill that. Where in the middle, some of the kids, there's a couple that have the option to go to 3 middle. They live within the boundaries in a sense of 3 middle schools. And then you look at the map on the right, and this represents over 2,000 middle school students, so about a third of the whole population, who don't live within 1.25 miles of any school. So if you do use a nearest school model, then what you have is you have to figure out what to do with the 1/3 of students that don't live near a middle school. Where do they go? And that begins, again, pushing some of those filled circles. You got to push some folks around. And as you can see up in the northwest corner of our district, there's a school's worth of kids up there that reside at the middle school. Craig, anything to add on this?
No, I mean, as we were playing, you can kind of see what the boundaries underneath the circles look like that we needed, that so far we've proposed in order to be able to capture enough students to reach the nearest middle school to that are located in the region. And if we could move middle schools to match where the students are, that would have been the ideal situation. We were fortunate to be able to work with the city to be able to get the 3 locations in a Northwest, Northeast, and South for the 3 new middle schools to begin with. We had been scouring prior to our partnership with the city. We'd been looking for 12 to 20 acre plots of land within the school district and weren't really having a lot of luck.
Craig, do you want to talk about the high school version of this same map?
It's a pretty similar concept where we're trying to figure out where do we have to draw our locations in order to be able to draw our boundaries in order to be able to serve as many students as we can. One of the things that we've heard over many, many years, particularly in the Northwest, are the Woodridge, really more the Indian Trail, Pacific Park neighborhood, and their frustration with the boundaries that were established 40 years ago and having to be bused past Shadle Park to go to North Central. And this is one option to be able to kind of balance enrollments out across schools and also recognizing the similar struggles that we have with the middle schools, and that our high schools are not strategically placed at the best places where our enrollment is.
Thank you, Craig. And a large district in this state had for many years attempted a model such as this, where you have first priority to your high school if you're within a certain boundary. And if you're outside that boundary, you get what's left over. And if that's the model in Spokane, that means that about 25% of the high school kids would have no priority assignment. They would only get what was left over, what room there was at any given school. And Harriman was actually on the Seattle School Board when these changes occurred. And by moving to a neighborhood and cohort model, I think they saved $11 million a year the first year on transportation, I believe. So it's pretty phenomenal difference. And that's why this model really doesn't work very well for Spokane. So as we look at the next slide, where the committee landed when they finished up their work and took a short break in the summer was they had a rough allocation of somewhere along the lines of trying to get kids at their nearest school, as well as trying to balance schools. It wasn't a full cohort model yet, but they had done the elementary and the middle and the high school work once. Then we're going to come back at it for the next 6 months and refine it district wide. They had done it in sort of chunks. And this was the model that where they had left. And in this model, 14 elementary schools are split. And what that means is kids in 14 elementary schools scatter off to different middle schools and may or may not return with their friends and neighbors for high school. And we had a couple schools in the middle of the district, especially in the north, where kids were split going from elementary to middle and then split again from middle to high. And again, all the research indicates that that's about the roughest thing you can do on transitions for kids, is to continue to separate them from their peer group. So this is a table model of that same data. Craig, anything to point out here?
Yeah, I think this one, as we were looking across what was happening to our elementaries, we were noticing that there are 14 of our 34 elementaries that were being split, and ranging from roughly a 50-50 split to some that were more like 40-60, 30-70, and I think we went back to try to determine, is there something that we could do that looks that takes into account feeder patterns and tries to resolve some of those things.
Thank you, Craig. And that led us to this next slide, which the committee, as they continue to refine their work, sent us back to do some analysis. And it was, to Harriman's point, kind of remarkable. We wouldn't have guessed that a city the size of Spokane could have a pure cohort model. So we ended up being able to bring to the committee, and they were appreciative of it, a model where students stay together. So there is a model of this where no elementary student leaves their school to go to middle school. All elementary schools go to middle schools together. The committee did feel that it needed to do a little adjustment, which took it to about 4 elementary schools of a split. But again, that's the place they're in right now, wanting to get feedback from the community to say, have we done that correctly? Because it could be 0, it could be 4, it could be more. But this cohort model, as you can see, this is where they've landed. And there is 1 middle school split in all models, and that's because of an unequal amount of middle schools to high schools, especially in the South Hill area.
Yeah, and one comment on the 0 elementary schools being split. The thing that we struggled with mostly was the new South Hill Middle School. Across all of our middle schools, we have 34 elementaries and 9 middle schools, which translates roughly to 3 to 4 elementaries per middle school if we're drawing direct feeder patterns. The challenge with the new South Middle School is that if we're picking between 3, 4, maybe 5 elementaries to be the best candidates for that middle school, 2 of those 5 choices, Jefferson and Adams, actually have the other South Hill middle schools inside their boundaries. So we were challenged with what elementaries would we have to choose in order to not have students inside an elementary that also houses a different middle school inside its boundary.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, there is some complexity here. I'm going to ask Ryan if you wouldn't mind speaking to the next 3 slides, giving you a little sense of impact of this refined model of the cohorts. What's the impact district-wide?
Sure. So as we've been mentioning, one of our objectives was really to limit the impact of movements whenever possible. We knew at the middle schools that the impact was going to be at least 33% because we were adding the 3 new middle schools. We intentionally limited the impact of elementary school movements to 8%, and we were really only making adjustments to elementary school boundaries when necessary to resolve oversubscription at a school, meaning the school enrollment population made it challenging or impossible to meet our class size reduction goals with that population of students. The other times we moved it was when we had pending residential developments, so we knew that the population would swell due to imminent development. And then to take advantage of capital investments that we've made in the district. So balancing the schools, as Dr. Anderson pointed out. The 42% is a little bit more than the minimum of 33% that we would have gotten, and that was because we were moving towards that cohort model. So as was previously mentioned, one of the early looks at the proximity model with the middle schools was that we would have 14 elementary splits to middle school, and so in trying to look for a way to resolve that, we came up with the cohort model, and so that does bring it up to the 42%, and then continuing with that cohort model at the high school. Trying to bring full middle schools when possible into the high school. Some of the cohorts did change their full middle school feeder pattern, and the overall numbers for the district are, about 30% of students will have a revised feeder pattern over what they previously would have had.
Thank you, Ryan. Maybe explain briefly on this next slide how the impact of 6th graders, the grade configuration change, where 6th graders will now be in elementary, how it necessarily, in addition to building the 2 new middle schools, it causes displacement of existing students. Sure.
So that's one of the questions we've gotten a lot from the community members is, why can I not attend my same middle school? Why do those boundaries need to change? And so you can see from this slide that we have, just as a generic example, 800 students at a middle school with 700 or 400 of them being 7th graders and 400 of them being 8th graders. Well, to bring in that 6th grade population to allow for class size reduction at our elementary schools, we need to move out 270 7th and 8th graders to make way for the new 270 6th graders. And so that means that, for our current middle schools, their geographic boundaries needs to shrink. And so one of our big challenges was finding, with the way our middle schools are clustered, the right cohorts to move into each of those middle schools.
Thank you, Ryan. And then this last one.
Sure. Yeah, and so one of the things the committee really worked hard on was limiting disruption and keeping students together. 99% of elementary students stay with their neighborhood cohort all the way through to high school. As we mentioned before, one of our original maps that we had developed had more of a proximity alignment, but it had 14 splits. Some students split at middle and high school. This allows us to maintain clear cohorts all the way through, with the exception being the South Hill. On the South Hill, you have 2 middle schools, or 3 middle schools, excuse me, feeding 2 high schools. And so we needed to split up one of the middle schools in order to make the 2 high schools balanced. And so right now in our current developed map, we have Moran, Adams, Hutton, and Wilson all splitting. But like I said, with 99% of students following their same cohort all the way through.
Thanks, Ryan. Mark, did you want to talk a little bit about the legacy status? Oh, you're muted, Mark.
Thank you. So one of the guidelines that the previous committee came up with was to have some way of reducing transitions during boundary changes. And so what the legacy status is that all of our students who are currently 9th graders, when the boundaries change and are going to go in 10th grade, they would get to finish at the high school that they started. Same thing with middle school. All the students who had started at a middle school as 7th graders, they will get to finish their middle school experience at the same middle school if they elect to not go to the school that maybe where the boundary was changed. Elementary, the same thing with 5th graders. So rising 5th graders. So I've been an elementary student at an elementary school, kindergarten through 4th. I would get to finish my elementary career at the school that I started in. That's one part of the legacy policy. The second is that students whose boundary has changed and they want to stay at their former school, they would get first right to choice back into that school over any other students except a neighborhood student. So if the school has capacity, they would get to go back to that school and then stay there through the end. They would have to provide their own transportation because it would be part of the choice policy. But at least they, priority-wise, they would get a higher priority given the impact of a boundary change. So that's the legacy policy, that it kind of smooths the transition into different boundaries. And as Ryan said, this is only applies to about 8% of elementary, about 40% of our middle school, since we're adding 3 new middle schools. Then we also have, as you know, in Spokane schools, we have a very robust choice program that allows students, if there's capacity at a school, to choice into that school. That would continue. And matter of fact, it will probably become a little bit better now that we're trying to balance out capacities of schools. So families still have that option of choicing into schools. As far as option programs, this boundary adjustments don't affect our option programs like Spokane Public Montessori, the community school, the Institute for Science and Technology at North Central High School. Those are option programs that students have been admitted into. Then all of our special needs, special education programs also that are located in different parts of our schools. Boundaries don't affect where our special programs are located.
Thanks, Mark. Ryan, can you real quickly just reference the next 3 the slides of tables and just tell folks what they're looking at? This slideshow is available up on the district's website on the legacy area, so you can have some more time to look at it, but we want to sort of show you how they've laid this out so you can find your school quickly.
Sure, yeah. So the maps can be a little bit challenging for people to read and find out exactly how these boundary changes as currently drafted would impact them. So what this table does is show, first off at the elementary school level, whether or not there was adjustment at your school. Like we said, we really tried to limit our elementary school disruptions. And so we didn't have very many elementary schools that are impacted. If your school is impacted, this tells you whether students are moving in, out, or both in and out. So for example, Arlington, they were over capacity. And so they have students moving out to Linwood. And then the columns at the middle school cohort column to the right shows that all of Arlington, Litcherwood, and Whitman will be going to Gary. Gary, for example, a lot of folks have had questions about, Gary is very close to them. Why are Arlington, Litchfield, and Whitman going to Gary? And the answer is Gary has about 900 students within 1.25 miles from it. So it really could be the neighborhood school for quite a few students. But the population of Arlington, Litchfield, and Whitman would be approximately 520 students. And so that matches with Gary's available capacity of 550 students. So as you go down the table, you'll be able to see on if we go down to the next slide, and let's actually just let's skip to the South Hill, because that's the one with the splits. Then you'll see in the far right column, if your school has a split in enrollment, it'll show you approximately what that split is and where those students would go. And we will be putting out in more detailed information for students at split schools, letting them know by address how this change will impact them once we get to more towards the finalized boundary map.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I want to make sure we have some time for some additional answers. I will also refer you, if you're in this webinar, to the Q&A section where we have answered nearly half the questions that have been proposed. So if you do want to click on that, you can see that many questions have come up during the meeting that are being answered, but we will have a Q&A time at the end also and try to answer some of those live. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and have Craig walk us through primarily the north side of the district, since that's the focus of this session. And the next one, we thought we would divide the district in half, and we can focus for about 5 minutes at elementary, middle, and high each on the key changes and some of the decisions that came up on the map side. So Mark, I'm going to swap, if you don't mind, and share that. So here you should be seeing the proposed draft elementary map. And Craig, do you want to just walk us through some of the key changes and maybe some of the key decisions that led to these boundaries?
Sure. On the north side, really, the major changes, we'll start in the northeast. Linwood has been built it's a brand new school and was built with more capacity as there was some available land to build that school a little bit bigger in order to help out with neighboring attendance areas that were overcrowded. Arlington is the school in the Northeast that currently has the most students enrolled at it. So we have a proposal to move the current Arlington line further east to Nevada and have Linwood pick up more of those students. And so that's really the Northeast major change, is shifting the Arlington and Linwood boundary. Then really most of the other, as far as elementary boundaries, really we go kind of to the west, and that is a change between Finch and Audubon and Holmes. So if you slide down just a little bit, there's the area that is called the West Hills neighborhood that currently goes to Hutton. Hutton is over capacity. It's a full elementary at the moment. So we were trying to figure out, is there something that geographically or space-wise makes more sense, or is a possibility? And one of the ideas from the committee was to move that area to the north side schools. And so taking that area, that kind of northwest Hills area, and moving it from Hutton, where it currently is, and moving them into Finch Elementary. That created a little bit of a challenge because there were just enough students that it then made Finch a little bit full, and kind of as Phil was referring to earlier about the balloon concept across the system is pushing on one side and then stuff pops out on the other. We then changed, the committee proposed a change to move some of the current Finch students into the Audubon neighborhood, and then some of the current Audubon students into the Holmes neighborhood. And Holmes is actually the school that had the most capacity amongst the three. And so it kind of, it balanced out the total enrollment across the three schools in comparison to their current capacities. Most of the rest of the changes enrollment wise for elementaries occurred south of the freeway.
Craig, do you want to talk about middle school then?
Sure. So middle school, what we were looking at as an opportunity, particularly in the north, I mean, currently we have 6 middle schools feeding to 5 high schools, and we have some elementaries that we're currently feeding to 2 different middle schools, and one of our elementaries feeds to 2 different middle schools and then gets split into 3 different high schools. And what we were looking at is whether or not we could look at the 6 middle schools and the 3 high schools that are all on the north side, and whether that would make sense to create a structure that would have 2 middle schools feeding directly to 1 high school, and not creating those multiple splits across the K-12 continuum. So the structure that is being proposed by the committee at the moment is to take 3 or 4 elementaries in each region that are nearest, not the nearest, but near to each of the middle schools, and then have those middle schools feed to the high schools. The challenge, particularly in the Northwest and the Northeast, is that in the Northwest, the 3 middle schools are all within 1.5 to 2 miles of each other. And similarly, that is the case in the Northeast. So in order to fill the middle schools to an equal or equitable capacity based on the size of the schools, we were looking at having to figure out where we would have to draw lines, and recognizing that there are places where students and families are literally across the street from another middle school, and this proposal would be sending them in a different direction. If you look at the map where Phil has it zoomed in right now, Westview, Ridgeview, and Brown, there are many students that could walk to Salk. As we were looking at those circle maps earlier, we could do that, but then there wouldn't be enough students to fill the new Northwest Middle School. And if we could have chosen or found another 12 to 20 acre plot of land that would fit where the need of middle school students are, that would have been ideal. But we had to work within the constraints of where our middle schools are going to be located.
Thank you, Craig. And how about a few minutes on the high school? Because I think it's similar, some similar questions.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the questions, I've worked in this district for a long time. One of the questions that has felt like a question over the 40 years that the boundaries haven't really changed, is that in the old high school boundary, there was North Central creates kind of almost a horseshoe shape around Shadle, Shadle Park. And a lot of families were wondering why it is that they needed to be bused past Shadle Park in order to go to their to North Central. And using the cohort structure, we also were trying to look at where the populations are and what the sizes of the schools, what the sizes of the enrollments within the current boundaries were, and noticed that in the current Shadle Park boundary that was surrounded by North Central, there were only 1,200 students inside that region. And in contrast, the region that is currently, and it's not on this map, but this is the proposed map, Lewis and Clark High School had a pretty significant geographic boundary that had them north of, had more than 1,700 students inside its region. So it created a disparity of enrollment between the two schools, LC being the biggest and Shadle being the smallest, and the other three kind of being a little bit in the middle. But of the difference of 500 students between high schools creates an imbalance in what kinds of programs can be offered. Things such as the number of foreign language programs that can be delivered first year, second year, and third year and fourth year, or the size and quality of music programs and arts and drama programs. So one of the interests of the committee was to try to figure out, is there a way that we can redraw these high schools such that the populations come out more similar in population size based on their boundaries and geography.
Thank you, Craig. Mark, I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Go back to mine here. So with that, we are going to, tonight, Phil has agreed to moderate some of the question and ask our panelists for comments. We won't be able to get to every question. As I mentioned, we're going to use the questions and the comments to the committee. We'll be able to capture all those. And then if there's a question that you have also that you would like to get information to the committee, that boundaries@sps81.org email. As I mentioned earlier, I would encourage everyone to take time to look at the FAQs that are on the district's website. We keep adding to them, so that may answer some of your questions. And then our committee will go back to work after these 4 forums based on the questions we're hearing, both at the forums and then that we're getting in emails, and we'll go back to work on the draft that we have, headed toward trying to get a recommended boundary adjustments to the school board by June. So with that, Phil, I'll let you moderate and ask some of our committee members questions.
Thank you. And I was taking the opportunity to scan, and again, it looks like we're almost keeping up with about half. And so if your question isn't answered tonight, and we'll try to generalize some that might capture multiples, feel free to look at the FAQs or know that we have collected your question and we're bringing them all forward to the committee, as well as trying to answer as many of them as we can on the FAQ site, which will be updated regularly. I think one question I wanted to start with, because I've seen it in thematically through a couple, and I think I'm going to ask Craig to just talk to this real briefly, is the choice question of like, how does this impact me exactly on when the transitions go into effect, and what kids would be impacted from, in what grade are they today? Can you just give us a quick overview of that, Craig?
Sure, a quick overview.
I know, keep it simple.
Yeah, I mean, so I think with, particularly since we aren't proposing to move significant numbers of elementary students, our hope would be that we can accommodate some amount of choice to be able to keep families attending the schools that they've been accustomed to. That won't be the case for all, because we are trying to right size and create balanced schools so that all schools can have lower capacity, lower class sizes in their schools. We have a handful of schools that currently they're the fullest. Each of their classrooms are full, and they have more classrooms used across their elementary, and so they don't have the space to have an art classroom or a science classroom, so that's part of what the goal in moving some of those, changing some of those boundaries is. With regard to middle school, again, it goes back to the concept of moving sixth graders into our current 7 and 8 middle schools, that in order to move sixth graders in, some 7th and 8th graders are going to have to move out. And that really was the concept behind adding 3 new middle schools, was to be able to increase by a third. So from 2 grade levels to 3 grade levels, the experience of what's happening with our students, and being able to have 6, 7, 8 middle schools, which is across Washington, that's a pretty common middle school delivery model, is having 6, 7, 8 middle schools. And that's a challenge, because families that have been in love with their middle school feeder pattern, roughly a third and slightly more than a third of families are going to be shifted to a different middle school than the one of that they currently would be designated to go to in their current feeder pattern.
And Craig, can you just give a sense of who would, like what students today would be impacted as these things roll out?
Is it K2? I think you told me.
Is that right? Is it K?
Right. So kind of walking the path of when the Northside elementaries change, Northside elementary, middle, and high schools change in the 22-23 school year. Those rising 5th graders would be the legacy students that get to stay. So I'm taking it backward. That means in the 21-22 school year, it's the 4th graders that would be part of that legacy. And then that means in the 2021 school year, those are the current 3rd graders. So any students that are K2 or moving into K or currently preschool, those would be the students that would fall under the choice policy, and not the automatic, they get to stay through the legacy policy.
If they
It is a little bit different. It happens 1 year later on the south side, because the schools don't move until the 23-24 school year. But we are going to be doing the kind of the choice reset for all students that are K2 this year, because we have some students that live on the South Hill or the south side of town and choice into Northside schools, and vice versa, where we've got Northside families that are choicing into South schools. And if we don't review and change all those all at once, we end up with kind of a mixed, unbalanced. Oh well, why did you get to stay? Because well, I live on the south side and my boundaries aren't changing until 23-24, but I'm attending and choicing into a school on the north side.
Thank you, Craig. So any student currently in 3rd grade or higher is roughly unaffected by the boundary changes when they go into effect. Is that correct? And then students K2 or lower will be having having patterns that they may not fall into a legacy status on.
I would say that's true for elementary. For middle school, it will be, so the way that the middle school legacy policy works is we're going to open the new Northwest Middle School and the new Northeast Middle School with only 6th and 7th graders. So currently with only 2 grade levels at Glover, Salk, Shaw, and Gary, the 8th graders at those schools at the year of the change, they'll move on to high school. So they won't need to be, they won't need to have legacy to stay at their middle school. The 7th graders would be the ones that we don't want them to have to transition twice. So those 7th graders that would become 8th graders would get to stay at their current, one of those current 4 middle schools. All of the incoming, so they're currently 5th and 6th graders that would be the new 6th and 7th graders at those new, at all 6 of the middle schools on the north side. The 6th and 7th graders would be new to Glover. The 6th and 7th graders would be new to New Northwest Middle School, etc. So we would be shifting the boundaries at that time so that we aren't changing boundaries on somebody who was at the school already, but you might not be attending the middle school that you were planning on 4 years ago because now there is a new middle school and that is your new boundary.
Okay, thank you. And I know this can be confusing for some folks, and for others, it's not much of a change. But we'll work with the district, and we'll get some graphical pieces on there so you can easily figure out how it might or might not affect your family, and then you can plan accordingly as the years come on to when these boundary changes will go into effect. And that's the key thing. And then you and your family can make choices between now and then if you'd like. Another question that we have coming, and I'm going to ask Lindsay to speak to this. The committee is, from the very start, we showed you that one map of the slices of free and reduced lunch. We've been very aware of, is there an opportunity to try to get some balancing done? We're also aware that it's really difficult, and Harriman and I are not aware of any city that's successfully tried to balance its free and reduced lunch through boundaries. It's a much better approach to address the school outcomes through program than through boundaries. And those two need to be married up. And I'm pleased to say that in Spokane, the superintendent is 100% online with that each school needs to equitably get what it needs to be incredibly successful in light of the boundary changes and between now and the boundary changes. But the committee has done some struggles with this. And Lindsay, could you just speak a little bit to the work we've tried and struggled at, and maybe where we're at and what more is left to do?
Wow. What more is left to do? I feel like there's so much. This is such hard work, and I would love to see our schools be more equitable for all of our kids. I think all of our kids are very important, but just like the water balloon, I think is the best way to put it. And there's just a large population of free and reduced lunch kids in the north side of our city. And with the river being the boundary kind of divide, I think for the most part, it's just really difficult to see those numbers be more equitable, I guess.
And I guess just could you talk a little bit about how many, have we addressed those? And then can you give an example of some of the challenges we found trying to address those, I guess, would be my question.
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time with the River Run area, and just thinking about how, as that area grows, how it could bring a lot of, I think having them on the north side could bring a little bit more equity to the north side of Spokane. And yeah, we have looked at the numbers. It's very difficult. And I think there's still work to be done, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that when we worked on the southeast side of the district, we were actually getting down to little populations block by block of that. We had 3 or 4 options of some students that we needed to move around for balancing, and really we're trying to do it and look at not displacing, not exacerbating free reduced lunch differences when we could, but not always successful. Because we always try to put in like, what's the best for the kids and the families whenever possible. and some of that becomes good on a spreadsheet, but bad in reality. I'm just trying to see if we have some more themes here. Let's see. So we talked about equity a little bit, and we are struggling with it. I will say there's a lot of questions about that, and I'm very comfortable saying it's not possible without busing, like the form of busing that the courts have not allowed districts to do, to try to socioeconomically integrate your city through boundaries, because that's not where people live and that's not where the schools are. So you end up with basically not boundaries, but programmatic boundaries. So I think that, while it's desire, I think it's the best we can do by looking at how we bundle the cohorts and which cohorts maybe can go to what places. And I think that's what we're working on there a little bit. Let's see.
I think, Phil, I think Molly had something to add to that. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's great. Go ahead, Molly.
And you pretty much said it right after I said I wanted to speak. So what I was going to say is that it's not equitable to bus people across the city. And we've tried not to do that as much as possible. And so that's come up over and over again. And we've spent a lot of time talking about how to prevent that from happening. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thanks, Molly. There were some questions about growth and where it's happening and some examples of that. And Peter, I'm just going to put Peter on the spot and feel free to say no. If the area, that Qualchin area, that area, south, that is now being directed to the new north, the new South Middle School, because of growth issues there and sort of the squeeze on the Jefferson, Hutton, Wilson area. Do you feel comfortable just talking about a little bit what the committee talked about on that and how they came up with some decisions on those neighborhoods?
Sure. There's some property owned by the school district around that Qualchin golf course area that is potential possibility for a future elementary school that would have to be put on a bond in the future. Talking to the community, that's 8 to 10 years away, most likely. But to lower the impact of moving kids around, it has been brought up at this point to keep those couple sections of the West Hills neighborhood going to Hutton, because in the future they would be easily split off to go to that new elementary school that could possibly be built once there's some possible revisions to 195 to make it safer for that school to be built down there.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you.
I just might add, Phil, to Peter's comment, we are finding that the two areas of property for developers are on the west side of the district. You've probably seen a lot of it in the paper recently about, and Peter's right, 195 needs better access, but developers are just waiting because there's land there. And then the other side is our east side of the district, where we're getting a lot of development. So we're kind of, those are the two, extreme edges of the district that are poised for lots of growth.
Thank you. And someone did ask a question, isn't this supposed to be a north side form? And yes, I apologize. I was bringing up a couple of examples on the south side, and I'll try to keep those to the north side with similar, in a sense, some of the same challenges are on both sides in different places. And as Dr. Anderson just explained, it's the edges that are the most difficult, just because there's the least amount of flexibility from options. And again, that northwest corner, they need to come down to a school, and that begins filling up schools. I was going to see here if we have, as I roll through the questions, Julie, would you be comfortable talking a little bit about, as we try to look at some of the neighborhoods, for example, or some of the elementary schools that we know are primarily free and reduced lunch basis, and we looked at how not to impact those families or how we were impacting those families if they had to go to a further away school. Can you just talk about a little bit about the conversations we had on the committee and sort of where we're at on that?
Yeah, so as everybody's noticed, free and reduced lunch is high. It wasn't the only metric we looked at when considering families' income levels, but it's definitely an important one. We had cases where, in trying to do some of the balance, whether it came to busing kids one direction to another to balance out schools, which many of you saw the map of if we bus kids, what it would look like in the division across the city, which is all vertical lines running up and down in order to balance that out. But some of the conversations we had were related to families being able to access those schools. We looked at busing patterns, where there were buses available to get families to things. One of the examples is actually, I'll use it's a South example for now, but we had a very large discussion about Grant and making sure it stayed at Sacagawea, because we were worried that families wouldn't be able to access the school as easy. Another thing we considered when we looked at was, although we tried to keep kids within a walkability where we could. Many of the maps, kids aren't right next to their school, or every kid can't be next to their school, but families who don't have transportation, that was definitely something we tried to look at and make sure that if there was an area that we couldn't address, that we were able to either ask for busing or information, or have the district open up discussions with transit so that if there was an area we needed to cover more, they can have access to it. So they were very hard discussions with the way that the city is broken up, unfortunately.
Thank you, Jen. There's been a series of questions kind of about equity, like how are schools equal? How are they the same quality when maybe the test scores are different, or they're in different parts of town and they have different free and reduced lunch amounts? And we have with us Stephanie, who's a principal at Holmes and going to be the new Northeast principal. And I think that we always say there's a program lever that's part of this, that the boundary committee it's not our lever to use. Our job is to try to work within those guidelines, but alongside of that is the district and their program levers to try to make sure every school is a high quality school. So can you talk a little bit about that, Stephanie, maybe what your experience has been?
Sure, absolutely. So Spokane Public Schools is dedicated to quality schools no matter where they're located. I understand, and obviously my experience at Holmes and then being the principal at the new Northeast Middle School, there's a continued conversation around equity and access. And one of the ways that we try and get after some of that is ensuring that there are quality programs at every one of our schools. It depends on the focus and the interest of our students, and we really do dedicate a lot of our purposeful programs within buildings to ensure that our students do have access no matter where they go. That is a continued focus no matter what school they go to.
Thank you, Stephanie. There was a question that I just saw as I scrolled through that it asked roughly, our transportation costs driving some of these boundaries. And I would say comfortably that no, what we've done is we've kept the transportation department close. They've come to many of the committee meetings, and we have sent questions and queries to them from the committee when committee members have said, would that be a significant change in transportation cost? And we brought that data back then to the committee. So we've been careful, I think, to keep an eye on transportation because it was one of the guidelines. But as of yet, and transportation is undertaking a review right now of the draft proposal to see if it would have any significant increases or decreases, but they're not driving the decisions. I would say that they are on the edge, and we're making sure that we don't make decisions that transportation would say, whoa, that's not going to work for any reason, or that's significantly out of bounds. Let's see. Why weren't the current proposed free? Oh, someone asked why weren't the current and proposed free and reduced percentages shown for the high schools? They were shown for the middle schools. That was just an example. to show the kind of data that the committee looked at. And we can certainly put the full data set up on the website so folks can see the differences between existing and proposed, and see what those look like across all of those metrics for all 3 levels. Absolutely. That was just an example on that. Let's see here. Considerations for athletics. You know, boy, that's a good, so question, the person's asking, were athletics given any consideration on the rebounding? And I would say that that's a conversation that's happening, and we don't have the key person on here that I would like to toss that to. Mark, do you want to speak to how we're handling maybe the concept of athletics and high school size from a boundary committee standpoint? Because there's parallel things happening on the athletic side, I know.
So yes, we are trying to balance our high school, mainly sizes, better than they currently are. But there's also the whole, which league are you in? But we went to our high school principals and athletic directors, and they said the first priority was the work that the committee's doing as far as the educational side, that kind of a second priority would be the league level that you're in. But with our work trying to balance sizes, I think we're getting closer to that, but it hasn't been the major consideration at this point. It's been a lens that we've been thinking about, but it hasn't been a major consideration.
Thank you, Mark. The committee has done a really good job, I think, of trying to stay to the guidelines, understanding again that there are programmatic aspects of education that go in parallel with it, but certainly the boundary committee is not charged with developing program or you know, an athletic balance at the schools, but rather interfacing with the folks that are working on that.
There's questions, Phil, about the guidelines. Maybe Harry can articulate.
Yeah, I just saw that. So
Peter can answer some of those.
Sure. You know what, I'd like, Rod, would you be willing to, there's some questions around the guidelines, you know, that series of guidelines and influencers, that is there a priority ranking of those that we've used? Can you kind of talk about how we've come at the things like diversity and neighborhood and transportation and enrollment size?
Well, I'll speak in general terms. That first map that they showed was the only way that you could socioeconomically try and balance the entire city of Spokane. And that's just logistically not possible. The problem that we have faced is that certain areas of town, the free and reduced rate is really high. And how do you adjust that? Unless you drastically change boundaries to the west, to the south, because northeast side of town, really, you're limited in what you can do. So I would say that we tried to look at all of those factors. Some meetings were spent more on a couple of things. Another meeting, perhaps we focused on some of the other things, and then went back and looked at where the proposed boundaries were at the time, because we bounced back and forth hundreds of times, it seems like. So that was the challenge. I don't say that we've necessarily got it right yet, but you know, that's what we were trying to work for.
Thanks, Rod. Peter, do you have anything you can add to that?
No, I think he covered it pretty well. It was just because the committee had previously brought those up, it was just to remind ourselves that there were a priority from a previous committee to cover those guidelines. And there was never one time that said like, this is absolutely the first thing we have to make sure we cover. It kind of ebbed and flowed with what we were talking about in the different parts of the city we were talking about.
Terrific, thank you.
Hey, Phil, I'd like to answer a question live.
Oh, you bet, go ahead, Julie.
Okay, this is from Kendra.
You're on mute.
Oh, you just want to mute. There you
Sorry.
go.
This is from Kendra. We did actually look at equity and the reduction of class size. I believe, and Phil, correct me, or Mark, correct me, Gary is one of the schools that has a lower capacity compared to other middle schools in the area. And so when we looked at putting kids into Gary, we were, in some schools, we were putting enough kids in to reach and just slightly fall under capacity by like 2 or 3 students. But in schools like Gary, we actually did try to decrease the numbers of students there. However, we wanted to be careful not to decrease numbers because that does affect funding for schools. So we still have to try to keep a school at capacity so that they don't lose out on funding, especially the low income schools. And I don't know if Craig or Ryan can confirm the numbers, excuse me, for Gary of what capacity is and what the estimated boundaries will put it at.
So Gary is one of our, will be our smallest middle school in the current environment with a maximum of about 650 students, where and maybe even more efficient or better, more comfortable at slightly smaller, even at around 600 students. Most of the rest of our middle schools will be either 750 or 850 as kind of their comfortable range for being able to serve all students and be able to give them access to all of the courses and programs that they're looking at. One of the things that I also think, as I've been looking through the questions, and lots of questions about income levels and quality, one of the things that also is maybe that we haven't mentioned is that higher socioeconomic, higher poverty schools have access to supplemental funding. So those are that is something that the state and the federal government use as ways to support and help students and families and schools that don't have the same kinds of resources as higher economic schools. At some of our higher economic schools, there still are students that are lower economic, have lower economic status, and they don't have the access to those funds. So it is a struggle for some of those schools to be able to serve the students that are maybe the same, have the same needs as students at a higher poverty school, but they don't have the supplemental funding to be able to do that.
And then we have about 1 more minute, and there's a question that a couple questions have come up about distance to schools, and I think like here's one that the group that's being redirected to Linwood, Sauk, and Shadle is 3.4 miles away, while it is just 3.3 miles to Rogers. And again, I would say that goes back to those circle maps that we just, it's not possible to send every student to their closest school, but it is possible to send them to their next school with their cohort peer, with the kids that they have gone to school with, the families that they've built connections with. And again, as we look at the research, it's just so important for those kids for all kids actually, but especially for kids who are struggling, to have those transitions happen with their peers. That is why some of the boundaries look maybe a little long and skinny versus round, because if we do round, again, we don't have anywhere to put 1/3 of the middle school students or 1/4 of the high school students. But when we do the cohorts, even if they look a little stretched on the map, the kids stay together. And again, the differences, we have looked at them, and most of the differences are not a significant drive. We've actually done the timings of the commute times. And sometimes that's influenced the committee. We've said, you know what, that's too much of a change. That's too much of a difference. We don't want to send those kids there, because that's going to be a big impact on parents and kids on the bus ride. And other times we said, well, it's within, a few minutes, so it might be okay. So that's kind of gets at those kind of questions. As I look at our questions, we've been able to answer about 70 to 80. And then we have about 80 some still open. So I think we're close to half, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Some of them, what we'll be able to do is bundle them up, and we will be able to address them on the FAQ. Some are very specific to neighborhoods, such as River Run or such as the area by Arlington and Linwood, and we'll be able to better answer those, I think, in a focused manner, and distill out the common pieces there. So thank you guys very much for this Q&A time. Mark.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks our panelists for their assistance this evening, and thank all of you for your interest and time. Certainly, if you want to come back, we have another Northside Forum next Monday night, and we would welcome you to come back. As we said at the beginning, we're going to use the questions and comments that have come in both in the webinars as well as emails that we were receiving to our boundaries at SPS.81. That will help the community. Our next steps are we're going to continue these webinars for the next couple of weeks, and then our boundary committee is going to go back to work based on the feedback that we're hearing from the community over this next 3 weeks. We're then going to have a work session with the board at the end of May, just to give them our tentative recommended thinking. And that's the chance for the board to have their chance to ask questions. And then the board, with the recommended boundary adjustments, they will have a hearing on June 2nd that, again, we're encouraging parents and patrons and staff to come and give their comments to the board. They will do what they call a first reading hearing on June 16th. This is where they still are taking input and asking our committee if possibly to make some more adjustments before they finally come for their final reading to make an approval at the end of June, June 23rd. Then, as I mentioned, the boundaries that will go into effect are really actually a year later, giving folks an opportunity to adjust for the north side, and then actually 2 years later on the south side. And Stephanie, who's going to be the principal of the new Northeast Middle School, is anxious to know what those boundaries are so she can start communicating with her families next year and starting to build, getting the staff hired and building a culture there. That'll be the same thing for the new Northwest Middle School principal, Matthew McFarland, or Matt, oh gosh, the name's skipping my mind right now. Matt, help me. Henshaw. So Matt McFarland's at SALT, but it'll give folks a chance to get ready for those new schools to open, as well as Matt McFarland at SALT. He'll know what the new boundaries are, what kids, elementary schools to reach out to. So thank you for this evening, everyone. You're welcome to come back next Monday night, same time, register for that one, or send in your emails to that SPS@SpokaneSchools.org. And again, thank our panelists for this evening and Phil for moderating tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.